Hello, my name is Philip Lovejoy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Alumni Association. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of our conversations on climate, this one titled Climate, Government, and the Economy. The Harvard Alumni Association helped to create this series of events in partnership with many dedicated alumni volunteers, because we wanted to play a significant role in convening diverse voices to discuss the existential threat of climate change and to learn from each other. We collectively felt we had a responsibility to connect the many experts and climate leaders from across the university, both students and faculty, and of course, alumni, to help us understand the many dimensions of the crisis we face. Personally, coming from a conservation-minded family who have done their part to protect thousands of acres of pristine wilderness in New Hampshire, where I'm zooming in from today, I find the topics being addressed in this series of conversations to be of the utmost importance to us all. As I mentioned, these programs have been developed by the HAA, working with our colleagues at the Harvard Office for Sustainability, and in partnership with a number of alumni groups, the members of the Harvard Radcliffe College class of 1969, the Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, and my friends and neighbors from the Harvard Club of New Hampshire. The coming together of all these communities to address climate makes me hopeful for the future. Climate change is deeply complex and will require all our good thinking, efforts, and yes, votes to get us through. I am grateful for everyone's dedication and hard work to bring all this together. These events are intentionally called conversations, as we hope they will drive further conversation in your communities and that the conversation will lead to action. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator. Miles Rappaport from the Harvard College class of 1971 is Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm delighted that Miles is serving as our moderator, given his work as an elected official and longtime organizer and policy advocate. I'll now turn the floor over to Miles.
Phil, thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I want to welcome everybody to the Climate, Government, and the Economy, Reform or Transformation. That's the topic of this version or this session of the series. We're here to discuss an incredibly important and fraught topic at an incredibly important and fraught moment in American history. We have an extraordinary group of panelists for the discussion today, so I don't need to make much in the way of introductory remarks. But before we dig into the topic, let me make a few preliminary comments. First, we at ASH believe it is important to say that the land that Harvard sits on today was originally the land of the Massachusetts nation, and it was a spot for centuries where nations came together to discuss issues. Second, I want to thank the significant group of sponsors and co-sponsors that Phil has already mentioned. And I want to give special thanks to Valerie Nelson and Terrence McNally for kind of initiating, imagining this discussion and inviting me to participate. Today is the second installment of a series of 5 sessions of the Harvard Climate Conversations. The first event, which featured President Bacow and top climate change leaders, took place on September 23rd. The next event, Changing Hearts and Minds About Climate Change, will be on November 18th. And hopefully you'll get good notices about that. We're about to have a serious discussion and thoughtful about the issues of climate change, the role that government, market actors, and environmental activists and citizens need to play to grapple with the enormous challenges ahead. We also see this as an opportunity to connect with each other and connect all of you with organizations and links that are doing that. So links will be posted in the chat as we go along, and you can take them as you get them. To state which we pretty much all know by now, if you're joining on Zoom, questions can be placed in the Q&A box. If you're watching on YouTube, ask your questions in the chat box and they will be shared with me. So as I said, we have 4 extraordinary panelists today from very different vantage points in the climate change discussion. We're going to proceed as a conversation, not as a formal presentation format. Their bios are mostly very long and impressive, and there are links to them and some of their work on the screen. So just to introduce them very quickly in the order that I will ask the first question. Phil Duffy leads the Woodwell Climate Research Center, until recently known as the Woods Hole Research Center. Prior to joining Woodwell as executive director in 2015, Phil worked on climate science research, climate change communications, and as an advisor to the Obama White House. Ken Maraff is the head of the Water Division of New England Region 1 Office of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's worked on environmental issues in and through government for a long time, and he knows and will share with us what it is really good at and what new challenges it's facing as the climate change situation develops. Chung is a Harvard student, class of 2023. He's the one with the shorter resume, but he's already made a powerful mark as an environmental activist, supporting fossil fuel divestment activities at Harvard, and quite remarkably, helping to organize a recent statement of 100 economists that was published in The Guardian, calling for a bold environment and economic justice agenda. Lastly, Danielle Allen is a good friend of mine and the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard Kennedy School and the director of the Edmond J. Safra Center on Ethics. One principal focus of Danielle's work is the study of democracy and citizenship, but she is passionate about climate change, economic and racial justice, and the practice of political economy as well. Danielle recently co-chaired the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where I had the privilege of working with her. I'm going to start with a brief question to each panelist, which is, how did you get to and how did you become dedicated to the climate change work that you are doing now? That's a short answer, and then I'll come back and talk to each of you about how you view the challenges ahead from your vantage point, focusing, if you can, on what can be done, what can work, and what we need to do. I have a small advantage in that we talked the other day, and I have a couple of quotes from you to start off with. Anyway, after that second round of questions, we'll go to the questions from the chat and make sure we leave enough time to give concluding remarks, the opportunity for concluding remarks to each of the panelists. So I'm going to start, if I can, with a question to Phil Murray. Phil, as the full-time scientist among us, what do you see as the challenges ahead, and what can science teach us about what it is that we need to do? You said the other day when we talked that, quote, when I started on climate change in 1990, it was kind of a theoretical proposition.
Sure.
Today, the impacts are so much clearer. The questions have become so much clearer. And as places begin to become uninhabitable, and how can we achieve cooperation when conflict and isolation can often be the prevalent responses? Phil, why don't you get us started with the scientific?
Well, so that's a lot, and I'm happy to do that. But maybe I'll just address how your first question, which is how did I get interested in this to begin, or how did I come to be in this field to begin with? And
I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Yes, do the first question. We'll come back.
The answer to that is what the answer always is, which is that it starts with my mother. And the story is that in the late 1980s, I had recently gotten a doctorate in physics. And my mom at that time, who was also a physicist, was an academic climate researcher, in fact, at Brown University. And I started talking to her about what she was doing. And it seemed like, well, it just aroused my interest. And it aroused my interest because I saw it as an opportunity to do something that would make use of my technical skills, but also have direct and immediate societal benefit.
Great. Okay, remember the second question so I don't repeat it again. And again, my apologies for running them together. All right, Ken, how about you? How did you get to where you are?
Well, so I remember sitting in 1985 in Pound Hall in a class on how to be a government lawyer. And speakers came in every week and talked about how satisfying it was to dive into these really complicated problems where there are so many trade-offs and pros and cons and no clear solutions. And their job was to weigh all of that and decide how we're going to move forward as a society to tackle these challenges. And I just thought that sounded like the hardest and most interesting job in the world. And so I was just passionate about going into public service. And when I saw an ad in the newspaper, this is how long ago it was an ad in a newspaper for a job at EPA, I was just thrilled. I got my start in this movement on the first Earth Day, like a lot of people my age, and have now worked at EPA on water issues in New England for the last 30 years. And if you're dealing with water issues, you are dealing with climate change because we're continually rebuilding our water infrastructure. So what climate conditions do we need to build for? How do we protect sewer systems and treatment plants from rising sea levels? How do we protect our wetlands and lakes and rivers that are most threatened by temperature change? How do we make sure our drinking water supplies are sustainable? So, and this is true in a lot of areas now. People who didn't get jobs working on climate change are working on climate change because the issue came to them. And so that's how I got here.
All right, great. Connor, how about you? How did you get into the activism that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't remember exactly when it was as a child that I first began to consciously think about this issue, but I do remember growing up just being absolutely terrified of the reality of climate crisis. You know, as a young person, I think sometimes news of what's going on hits differently. It's not a matter of statistics and charts, but a matter of our futures and our presence being on the line. I think that recent months have only shown that the climate dread of young people is entirely justified. It's hard to cry alarmism when, you know, one coast is on fire while droughts and hurricanes pound the rest. And adding to this sort of dread is the continued failure of governments, of economic and financial institutions, and other structures of power to take some of those basic steps towards climate action. To solve the climate crisis, we're going to need nothing short of a bottom-up reimagining of our economic and financial systems. Everything that's happening in the world right now is hopefully creating a moment where that's possible, where we have a golden opportunity to secure a better future for ourselves and our children. As I started to get involved in the world of activism, I found it such a source of hope on this terrifying issue. At this juncture in history, the voice of activism matters, and that's why I look forward to exploring these issues with my fellow panelists. Can't wait. Thank you all.
Great. I think you had a fabulous quote when you said at the end of kind of more or less what you were just saying now is that activism is the cure for dread. So I'm taking that to heart. Danielle, how about you? How did you get into this kind of work?
Well, I have to confess, I'm more of a newcomer in this space. In that regard, I think your introduction of me was a little generous. So I am what I would say I've been a lazy supporter of climate change for much of my adult life, like whenever I drive a Prius, that kind of thing, if you know what I mean. And then when I came to Harvard in 2015, I started working on questions of political economy and justice, and talking a lot with Rebecca Henderson in the business school, who tightly integrates questions of climate change to the question of a sustainable economy. And that was really helpful to me and helped me see how some of my intellectual work could be more tightly linked to the project of climate change. But for me, the actual turning point moment with regard to my own degree of commitment came, I can tell you, exactly what was the morning after the 2016 election, because I taught a 9 a.m. class. So I was the first point of contact for a room full of undergraduates processing the 2016 election. And a young man stood up in the class. He was the first person to speak and share his thoughts. And he gave the most compelling speech I've ever heard in any context about the failure of my generation to understand and respect the needs of his generation. Exactly the points Connor just made. The fact that existential futurity is on the line for everybody Connor's age and younger, and that we above that age line had not seen that and taken it to heart. I recognized at that moment that this issue is the Vietnam for this generation, and it was overdue for me to understand that fully and fully engage. So I've sought now to engage in my intellectual work, both again in the work on political economy and the work on governance, because to Connor's point, there's been a real failure of governance around this issue. And I think that there's some deep work we can do on structures of governance to make it possible for us to achieve change.
Danielle, we have to find that student and thank him for driving you to the climate change issue. All right, let me go back to Phil. Phil, and I won't repeat the question, but you're going to kind of give us our grounding, as people are fond of saying these days, in the science.
Thank you. And maybe if that student's old enough now, maybe we can get him or her to run for president. So yeah, I'm going to set the context for the conversation by telling us, well, reviewing a bit of what science says is at stake and what science tells us we need to do to help manage the risk. And I'll start actually 10,000 years ago when something extraordinary happened. And what happened roughly 10,000 years ago is that the wild swings of temperature, which had up until that point, or for the last million or so years, characterized Earth's climate, suddenly stopped. And the Earth, again, about 10,000 years ago, entered a period which we were still in until quite recently of unprecedented climatic stability and also warmth. So the climate changed from being this volatile, hostile thing to being warm and benign. And we think that that is why civilization started to develop roughly at that time, about 10,000 years ago. For example, with the simultaneous emergence in several parts, or near simultaneous emergence in several parts of the world of the practice of agriculture, which obviously is foundational to civilization. So the message, I think, from that for us today is that a safe and stable climate is foundational to human well-being. Fast forward to later in the last century, it was around the 1970s when scientists started to have serious conversations about human influences on climate. And it turns out, actually, coincidentally, that, for example, the first National Academy of Sciences report on human influences of climate, as it happens, was written in Woodwell, Massachusetts, where I'm speaking to you from, in 1979. Now, at that time, the idea that humans could change climate was entirely theoretical. It wasn't something that at that point we'd seen in observations. That didn't happen. The detection of human influences in actual observations didn't happen until the early 1990s. And in 1995, a United Nations body of scientists called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made the first statement of, okay, we see in the Earth's temperature record, we see signs of human influences, meaning fossil fuel burning and deforestation. So that was 1995. Now, at that time, although human influences were detectable, they certainly weren't prominent, and it took a careful statistical analysis, in fact, to reveal them. What's happened in the intervening 25 years, of course, is that the human impacts on climate have become very, very obvious and very, very material, and in fact, quite disruptive. And we're seeing that in things like increases in wildfire. Conant mentioned tropical cyclone activity, floods, extreme heats, and so forth. All of those things, which are changes in the physical environment, translate into human consequences. And those human consequences include things like increases in food scarcity, increases in water scarcity, decreased ability to work outside, human health impacts, and so on. And in my mind, the big issue that literally keeps me up at night is the idea of, as parts of the world become difficult to inhabit, the idea of large-scale migration, either caused or contributed to by climate change. And I think history shows us that large-scale migration is not something that we handle gracefully. It leads to nationalism, it leads to armed conflict, it leads to political instability. And for me, the big challenge is that the climate change itself, which requires unprecedented levels of cooperation, at the same time, the effects of climate change push us in exactly the opposite direction, push us towards isolationism and nationalism. And in my mind, that's one of the big challenges we need to address. Now, in terms of scientifically, what do we need to do to stop climate change? We need to do two things. And one is we need to stop making the problem worse. We need to stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. In order to limit warming to what we think is an acceptable level, we need to do that by around the middle of the century, around 2050. Now, that alone, stopping the addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, it's important to understand, doesn't make climate change better. It simply stops it from getting worse. And we think, therefore, also that in order to limit the warming to what we believe to be an acceptable level, we need, in addition, to remove a large quantity of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, much more, in fact, than we know how to do right now. So we face enormous challenges. There's a role there for individuals, a role there for governments, a role for the private sector. In my work at Woodwell, we work with all three of those groups. I hope I get a chance to discuss some of what we're doing, but for the moment, I'll turn the floor back over to Miles.
Thank you, Phil. That was a 10,000-year tour in about 5 minutes. That's not bad. All right, Ken, let me ask you. You've been in government for a long time. It's clear that government and governments internationally must play a key role in the solution of this crisis. You said in our conversation, government functions best when there is a clear and discrete problem to solve. But with climate change, the problems are incredibly complex, with all kinds of actors that are non-governmental needing to be involved. So this is a new kind of environment, and how can government be at its best as we go forward?
Thanks, Miles. So I'm going to give you the perspective of a practitioner, and that perspective is that the government is very good at solving problems that have clear boundaries. For example, from my area of work, if you have a river that's polluted because of what's coming out of a pipe, we have all kinds of tools to address that. It's just a question of picking the right tool. And we're pretty good at solving problems even that are much more complicated than that. Lots of pipes, maybe all different kinds of pipes. You need different tools to address different types. We're still pretty good at that because it's still a problem that has clear boundaries. It's a water infrastructure problem. We just need more engineers. And a great local example of this is the Boston Harbor cleanup, which was a massive cleanup problem of huge, incredible complexity that required enormous resources, but the dimensions and the boundaries of the problem were clear. So with enough time and money, we were able to solve it. Climate change, on the other hand, is a problem that has few boundaries. It's entwined with so many other issues, as others have already mentioned on this panel. There's a whole system that it's part of, and to become more resilient to deal with climate, it's going to affect the way our neighborhoods are designed, our transportation systems, housing, our water systems, the economy, as Danielle mentioned. There are real fairness issues. There are all kinds of interconnections and feedback loops within this system. So it's very complicated. The silver lining of all that is that if we're able to develop the capacity to deal with these issues on this complex system level, we will find all kinds of synergies and solutions that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise. And I'll give you an illustration. There are a lot of communities are looking at green infrastructure as a way to become more resilient to climate change, restore the natural water cycle, prevent flooding, that kind of thing. But those all cost money. And so the municipalities are always weighing the cost and benefit of those kinds of projects. But what if those projects, if you looked at them as part of the larger system, you might realize they could also solve a water pollution problem, because the same pavement where the runoff is causing the flooding also carries pollutants into our rivers and streams. And cities and towns are making investments to solve those pollution problems, but maybe the same green infrastructure could address that problem at the same time as it's addressing climate resilience. If only you designed it with both things in mind at the same time. You're solving two problems at once that could tip the cost-benefit formula in a different direction. What if the same community also had a water supply issue? There are cities and towns in New England that their economic development is constrained because they run out of water. So if you design a green infrastructure resilience program with that issue also in mind, you could unlock some real economic rewards and maybe solutions that you wouldn't have found otherwise if you're looking at this more system level. So that's a simple example to illustrate the concept that systems thinking in the climate change world is really important. We can't solve these problems without looking at all these interconnections, and we'll find better solutions the more we're able to look at that type of complexity. The challenge is for all of us, government included, to get better at that type of problem solving and to do it without making it so complicated that you just throw up your hands in despair because everything is connected to everything else, so you can't really do anything. We can't tell people to go out and solve all the world's problems at once, but we do need to find the most important connections and do system level problem solving at the right scope and scale. So I hope we'll have a chance later to talk about some specific examples, but I'll stop there and let you move on to the rest of the panel.
Great. Ken, thank you very, very much. Connor, in some ways you embody the connections, the interconnections that Ken was just talking about. I mean, you've been a climate activist, but you've also ventured into the realm of economics recently by organizing a group of 100 economists from all around the world in a kind of a project that went almost kind of viral, and when it was published in The Guardian. So why don't you tell us about that, and it'll in a way be an interesting example of what some solutions can be as well.
Absolutely. So I think I'd really like to second what Ken and Phil were saying about the need to consider the interconnections when it comes to solving this issue. And I think if what's going on in the world now is proving anything, it's that these issues of injustice intertwine. That so long as a warming world disproportionately impacts some more than others, we cannot avoid the fact that climate justice is economic justice, is social justice, is racial justice, and so on. This isn't just a talking point, but a reality. Take two present crises, deep-rooted racism in America and the pandemic. There's a lot of wonderful research talking about how a warming world makes public health crises more frequent, and that communities of color face the highest rates of air too toxic to breathe and water too dirty to drink. Now, for a while, these questions of justice were seen as, in some ways, separate from the economic and the financial questions. We, as at the student campaign that I'm part of, we're kind of frustrated that we and others were out there talking about the need to consider climate justice. Well, parts of the economic and financial professions were instead trying to approach it through this very sterile sort of lens of carbon accounting and incentive aligning, a view that we felt was perhaps too myopic to fully address this issue. So we decided we'd seek to try to change that conversation a little bit. And so we organized an open letter. It was an open letter that sought to move beyond the very narrow sort of view and push for an economic recovery with climate action as a guiding principle. A letter, moreover, that was rooted in considerations of climate justice and fairness. To quote from that letter briefly, one moment, let me make sure I'm not misquoting my own letter. The carbon economy amplifies and begets racial, social, and economic inequalities, creating a system that is fundamentally incompatible with a stable future. If we fail to act now, the present moment may merely be a preview of what is to come, as we are forced into ever more painful situations and trade-offs. It is naive, moreover, to imagine that we can simply nudge the fossil fuel industry, so on, into good behavior. Instead, we should recognize that the present moment creates an opportunity to bring about a better future for ourselves and our children. By taking on the carbon economy, we can begin charting a pathway towards economic recovery while building a fairer, more sustainable world in the process. Hopefully, this is one small part of a broader change towards away from a very atomized approach to this problem and towards a big picture understanding necessary to tackle this crisis. That's one way in which, as a Harvard student, I was super honored to be part of this broader conversation.
Okay, and it was for those who I see the letters on the chat. It's quite an impressive list of economists. Many Nobel Prize winners in the group. Danielle, you obviously, as Connor has just said, these problems of climate change, racial justice, economic justice, social inequality are all tied together. And I know you've been doing some new work on political economy of the issues. I'd love to hear you talk about this. And, we'll come back to kind of solution-oriented questions in a few. But what have you learned from your recent work, and what do you have to add to this?
Thanks, Miles. I appreciate it. No, I think a number of the things I'd like to say tie together parts of what others have said. So I do think we can take the crises of the last 6 months as a kind of microcosm for a way of thinking about the problem of climate change. So COVID, for example, protests against police brutality, they have the same shape from a governance point of view, namely our political institutions have been unable to deliver effective solutions. In the case of police brutality, people have known, been advocating for more than a decade about what the right kinds of responses are with regard to police retraining, shifting of resources inside municipal budgets, a variety of things. So it's not as if there isn't clarity about the diagnosis of the problem and also pathways to solutions, yet our political institutions are not able to deliver any kinds of solutions. And I think in Connor's opening statement, when he was describing his experience as a young person, I mean, that really came out in his remarks, right? Sort of a recognition on the part of young people that the institutions of democracy are failing in one of their core responsibilities, namely responsiveness to urgent public crises. So in that regard, I think that really highlights one of the pieces of the solution that we need, which is to say reform to our political institutions in order to achieve responsiveness. That is, if they're not functional, we can't actually address any of these issues. And to some extent, I think the non-functionality around climate has developed a dynamic in our political discussion where some people sort of throw up their hands and say, well, more or less to heck with this democracy stuff. I mean, it's not going to work. We need to drive change in a sort of more forceful top-down way. And we should accept a kind of technocratic, expert-driven decision-making structures instead of robust democratic structures that empower ordinary people. So in that regard, I think actually the climate crisis is contributing to a crisis in our structures of democratic governance and whether or not they have legitimacy and ongoing viability themselves. So we have to make them responsive so that they can address issues like climate as a part of securing a constitutional democracy. So you mentioned the democracy reform work I've been working on. I mean, there's a host of things that can give us more responsive political institutions, and they range from things like ranked choice voting to multi-member districts to reining in campaign finance. I won't go through the whole list, but I would commend a report called Our Common Purpose put out by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And the reason that I am going through all of that is just to say that I do think it's really important that, for example, the democracy reform movement and the climate justice movement link arms. These two bodies of work, of activism and engagement, operate in separate spaces. I think both would be stronger through the forging of alliances. And then this brings me around to the political economy point, actually, because in the question of what does it take for us to refashion a political economy that incorporates inside the structures of the economy the costs to climate of our economic decision-making, and that actually permits us to make decisions about those costs. I think there too, we need different governance structures. So we've had a very rigid regulatory approach. Danny Roderick, one of the economists who signed Connor's letter, has really articulated, working with a colleague at Columbia named Chuck Sable, a different approach to regulation, which is in itself actually also more democratic, where you really work through private-public partnerships at all levels, national, regional, local, to deal with the complexity that Ken was pointing to. So in other words, the pre-existing regulatory model that we use does fit what Ken described as well-defined problems. It doesn't fit the complex systems problem space that Ken was pointing to. And for that, we do actually need a different kind of governance structure in order to deliver solutions. So the last thing I would say about Ken's point about being able to think in a systems fashion is I would turn the crank one more time on that idea. I like to talk about the need for integrated policymaking, and that is the kind of systems thinking that Ken was pointing to, but it's also about integrating direct consideration of questions of norms and values. The reason the solution space is so complicated is because it's also about setting priorities. So when we know we want to clean up Boston Harbor, that's a stable problem because we've been able to prioritize that within the set of things the municipality or state is thinking about doing. And the kinds of choices of prioritization that addressing climate change put on the table are enormously complicated and involve, as Conant was saying, just fundamental questions of justice, really. Who ends up living where on the globe? Who migrates? Who doesn't migrate? How much is invested in prohibiting or avoiding migration, as opposed to various forms of incorporation of people in new places, et cetera. So all the kind of fundamental questions of justice and social organization are at stake. And so in that regard, in addition to needing systems thinking, one has to actually integrate intentional orientation to norms, values, questions of justice, so that we can clarify our priorities. That is really hard work. So I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I think we can collectively build the resources to do it, but we should acknowledge that it's hard work.
Thanks, Danielle. Actually, I want to take this opportunity to go back to Phil just a little bit on the question of kind of solutions and public-private partnerships, and the kind of things that you see potentially working as we go forward.
Well, sure. There's a lot I could say there. Obviously, I've worked both in government and in my present role. I work with leaders in the world of business and finance, and I see distinct roles for both of those types of organizations. And one of the things, I'll just touch on what government can do, and then talk about our work with the private sector. I think one of the main things that government can do is change incentive structures, and through things like carbon taxes. Danielle just mentioned policies about where do people live, where do we provide emergency services, where do we provide state-funded insurance programs, and so forth, managing risk. All of those things are roles of government. And on a local level, governments are dealing with the consequences of climate change, things like increased flood risk, storm surge, and so forth. And those are terribly challenging problems. And we work a bit with local governments here in the Cape. And like many, they're under-resourced. They don't have either the financial or the intellectual resources to really come to grips with these problems. Governments also play, regulation, I think, plays a very, very important role. I mean, if you look at jurisdictions which have good comprehensive climate policies like California, they have a combination of carbon pricing through a cap and trade system, but they also have a regulatory program. And finally, the third, I think, really important role of government is, particularly national level government, is international cooperation and international leadership. And for the United States in particular, as a leading nation and as a leading greenhouse gas emitter, it's really, really important for us as a nation to set an example in addressing this challenge. Let me just turn to the role of the private sector, and I'll just illustrate, describe the work that we're doing at Woodwell, again, with leaders in the world of business and finance. And one of the things we're doing, and I'll just say our approach is, well, why do we do this work? We do it partly because we think, well, we know that the private sector needs to have an important role in addressing climate change. They can do things like allocate capital, and the private sector can also manage risk, for example, through the insurance industry. So we work with them because we think they have an important role to play. I should also say that the private sector has a powerful political voice and can have a powerful political voice if they choose to use it. So our approach to working with the private sector is a little unusual in the sense that it's based not on appealing to anyone's altruism or civic mindedness, but rather fundamentally on appealing to their self-interest. So, for example, we work with investors. We work with a large multinational consulting firm, McKinsey & Company, which advises corporations. And the theme of this work is that climate change is a risk. It's a risk to the businesses you advise. It's a risk to the businesses you invest in. And it's essential for these folks, for all of us, to understand those risks, recognize those risks, and manage those risks. And again, for us as a nonprofit, which is what Woodwell Climate Research Center is, our goal is that as the private sector comes to grips with the fact that climate change is a material risk, a material business risk right now, they will start to take steps to address that risk, including using their voice to engage politically.
Great. Engaging politically and on national policy leads to the first question from the audience, and I think I'll throw it to Ken first, and that is what do you think are a couple of the most effective national policies that could be enacted, at this point?
Well, so I'll give you, I guess, a New England perspective, because we are a New England regional office. The issue of resilience, especially to water, but also temperature and other climate impacts, is so critical here. And there's a lot of work that has to be local, but there's a real need for the federal government to bring in tools and support to states and communities that are grappling with these issues. So I think that's really critical. I really liked what Danielle had to say about the need for partnerships among all the levels of government, because some of these issues are local, but even the local issues, you can't ask a local DPW to develop a climate resilience plan without providing support. And that can come from the state level, but it's also really important to come from the federal level. So we are investing in those issues. There's a lot more that could be done. And just to take it one step beyond there, and this was also a point Danielle made, engaging the public in these issues is absolutely critical. And that is one of the ways that some of the values and norms of communities can come into play here and help determine what path we take. We need much better ways of engaging the public than the traditional government approach of you put out a draft, you ask for comment, you have hearings. We need to actually have much more proactive engagement of communities and all communities, making sure we're reaching people who don't typically engage in things like that. Provide people the tools and information to engage in a meaningful way and really listen.
Great. Okay, I want to go from the local to the international. Heather tells me that there are a number of questions about how we should think about and what can be done to really prioritize the needs of the underdeveloped countries around climate change, who are in some ways tremendously impacted by it. Anyone want to try to sort of take a crack at that?
Well,
I can jump in unless if somebody else, if Conant
All right,
wanted to.
you go first, and then Phil, you can add in.
I think that this is one of the hardest questions there is, but that's true across all policy domains. That is, it's not simply true around with regard to climate change. It's also true around migration policy, around economic policy. And conventionally, we think of these domains as policy separate from one another. I think this is the kind of point of the conversation that we're all having, is the importance of bringing these conversations together. And so for me, and this may be different from others, one of the most important questions is about empowerment within structures of global decision-making. So again, I do come back to questions of governance and ask questions about the relationship between the UN and national sovereignty and national decision-making and so forth, and the impacts of the way those things are currently structured on what's possible for the developing world. So a lot more to be said there, but let the others come in as well.
Phil?
Yeah, sure. And perhaps I'm going to state the obvious, but I'll state it anyway. And that is, in my mind, one of the most important things that we can do is to help the developing world develop without the use of fossil fuels. And the reason that that's so critical is that it's the developing economies which have the greatest potential for growth in greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, it's the developing economies where greenhouse gas emissions are in fact now growing. And it's very, very much in our own self-interest to help those economies develop through the use of very low carbon energy sources. And there's actually a mechanism in the Paris Climate Agreement for that. It's called the Green Climate Fund. This is a bugbear of certain political constituencies in the United States right now, because it involves giving money to poor folks. But again, it's very, very directly in our own self-interest to help these economies bypass fossil fuels and develop using low carbon energy sources. And it's also very much in our self-interest, as well as being humanitarian, to help these developing economies cope with the effects of climate change, which it's very well documented will have a disproportionate impact on them. And that is a very real fairness issue, because those economies have contributed very, very little to the problem, and yet they bear the brunt of the consequences.
Okay, there's a question that's sort of on the issue of the marketplace, and what do you want to say about the role of carbon pricing as a solution to the climate change issue?
Well, I'll throw in a little bit there just for a moment. So, carbon pricing is trying to provide a very clean regulatory structure for pricing in externalities, right? And so, I think this is to kind of Ken's point about, if you start by thinking the solution is going to be sort of simple and straightforward, you can use a traditional sort of regulatory method of pricing in externalities to think about it. But I think the more important point actually is the one that we've been making about complex systems, and the fact that there is not just about pricing in an externality that's sort of straightforwardly priced. There's many kinds of interacting effects that aren't straightforwardly captured by pricing. And so consequently, what you actually really need to do is rethink the structure of kinds of things that you're prioritizing and requiring in your public investments, and in the kinds of structures for engagement activity that you build for your private commercial enterprises. And that's where it really is a kind of from the ground up reworking of structures of the economy that can sound revolutionary to people. It's not actually. It's it's sort of what human societies do when they adapt. And in some sense, what you have to think about is the sort of processes of adaptation. And the question for me that's really important is, how do you govern that process of adaptation? And again, so in Roderick and Sable's work, there's a really good example of dealing with issues of water pollution for Irish dairy farmers that again kind of connects sort of consultative processes nationally, regionally, locally to work out the specifics of what the regulatory structure will be. Because as it turns out, it's actually the farmers themselves who understand there's sort of like 6 different kinds of soil that are affecting the issues of how the water runoff is increasing or not pollution. And actually nobody else has that knowledge and information. So there's this way in which you have to sort of pull all that expertise in. And so they knew things that wouldn't have shown up in any kind of formal traditional regulatory pricing structure. So the challenge is to kind of capture all the knowledge of an integrated complex system. And for that, you need a different governance process. So it makes sense that we've been kind of looking to a carbon tax over time as a thing that would be useful, but it's kind of like, generation 1.0 of a solution, I would say. I think it's sort of right in spirit, but it's where we need to kind of advance our understanding of how actually to understand the full array of costs, which requires a different kind of approach to regulation, and then prioritize our choices with integrated decision making.
And if I can just build on that, and I think to the direct question, there's a reason that a carbon tax is part of a lot of proposals for things like a Green New Deal, but there's a reason it's only part of it. Because we've long since left behind the days, if that ever existed, when nudges alone would be enough to fix a broken system. That's why we need to think more about how to transform the economy, and to what Professor Allen was saying, rethink what matters. There's a wonderful book by the economist Mariana Mazzucato called "The Value of Everything," and she argues that if you kind of look at early economic history, kind of the key philosophical question is one of value. What is value? Where does it come from? How is it determined? Over time, though, she says that we kind of left that behind. We ended up kind of adopting this very cold model of value, which is just market price times quantity. And as such, we have a philosophical misconception of what really matters. We assign worth to things which generate a price, even if it's at great cost to others, be it wealth extraction from our communities or environmental destruction. And we presume worthless things that cannot generate immediate prices, even if they do increase overall societal wealth. Things like investments in long-term communal flourishing or investments in environmental preservation. So I think that's kind of getting at the broader question you're mentioning, Professor Allen, about just the need to reconceptualize what matters. In terms of economic policy, on one hand, we need better measures. There are a number of economists who argue that GDP is just bad at measuring what's actually important. What good does it do if it keeps going up, even as our planet and society get sicker? But more importantly, we just need to rethink this question of what is worthy, what's worth saving, what matters.
And did the economists, Conant, just to follow up with you, who signed on to the letter, have anything to say on that issue, or what were some of the key things that they argued for?
Absolutely.
You have the letter, but just in case people haven't had speed read it yet.
Indeed. Well, first, I will note that Mariana Mazzucato, the author of the book I was talking about, was one of the signatories to our letter. But yeah, the letter's getting at that sort of thing. The three suggestions that it has are, one, we need to actively phase out the fossil fuel industry. It's not enough, certainly not good to keep subsidizing continued existence, and not enough to just wait for the problem to fix itself. Instead, we should actively phase it out and have institutions should likewise follow by ending fossil fuel investments and funding. The argument there is that so long as our banks and our insurance companies and our investors continue investing in the industry, it's actively providing social and economic capital necessary for the continuation of the status quo. And that instead, we should be shifting that money towards a renewable future, and in doing so, building political power to advocate for a fairer economic system. So one of the goals of this letter, one of the key points, is that if we attempt an economic rebuilding whose goal is return to business as usual, we'll miss the point. We'll substitute one crisis for another. Instead, we need to recognize that these crises create and amplify societal fault lines, and by approaching the issue from the standpoint of justice, from the standpoint of reconceptualizing what matters and how we value that, we'll actually hopefully be able to bring about a more just and stable future.
Great, thank you. Here's a sort of a painful question, but it is one that's comes up all the time, and that is, how much progress can be made in the situation we currently have, which is the abdication of United States international leadership. If we have a federal government that's actually hostile to addressing the climate change issue, and if we continue to have that, how much progress can be made? And is it in the words of the questioner, is all of this hopeless if the federal government is hostile to addressing climate change? Anybody want to start off on that?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, yes, it is unfortunate, and our federal government obviously for the last several years has, in my view, well, I think demonstrably actually worked to make the problem worse, and it's bad on a lot of levels, and one may be the more important may be the issue of international leadership, which I mentioned earlier, and I'll just illustrate that with a story from my own experience, and that was when I was working in the Obama administration. Well, in 2013, I met a new colleague who was brought into the White House from academia. And I went over to her desk and introduced myself and said, and she told me and her name is Kelly Gallagher, and she's an academic at Tufts, and I think a true hero in the fight against climate change. And she explained to me what she was doing, and it blew my mind. And the story is that she was brought in to negotiate a one-on-one climate agreement with China, China being the world's biggest emitter at the time, and the United States being the second biggest emitter. And she led 9 months of secret negotiations, and the result was actually successful. And you may remember that in November of 2014, about a year before Paris Agreement, President Obama and President Xi stood side by side and announced their national commitments to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And they were both very, very substantive commitments. And for the leaders of the two biggest emitters to stand together and make those commitments and announce those commitments together was a really galvanizing step, and I think something that was essential in making the Paris Agreement successful. And I can tell you that that sort of leadership really raises the bar for the other countries. And I remember at the time we were engaging also the government of India, which is and was the third biggest emitter. And I can tell you this really got their attention. And they clearly felt, okay, we really need to step up our game as the third. So that's an example of how leadership is really important. Absent that, I mean, we just have to keep doing what we've been doing for the last 4 years, which is work with you work where the opportunities are. Right now, there's a lot of opportunities at the city level, at the state level. There's opportunities in the private sector. And those are meaningful, those are substantive. You're never going to solve the problem if that's all you have. But if that's all you have right now, that's where you got to put your energy.
Any other thoughts on that from any of the other panelists?
I would add one more thing. I agree with everything Phil just said, but then on the last point of where the opportunities are, that's where I would come back to the fact that there are opportunities for democracy reform. There are also at the state level, it's ballot propositions at the state level that can bring in things like ranked choice voting, which brings non-incumbents into elected office more commonly. It opens up space for more diversity of representation. It would do a better job ultimately of giving space to the voice of young people who are advocating on these issues and whose generational size as a cohort is of such magnitude that at the end of the day, if they wanted to, they could really transform our democracy institutions as well as transforming specific issues. So there's that to push on as well. And then you get yourself a federal government that's better equipped to channel the voice of the generation, which at this point is bipartisan. It's really striking that young Republicans have a very different take on climate change from older Republicans.
I'll just add, as someone who works for the federal government, and as a government employee, I have no political opinions of any kind. And so I'm not going to talk about that. But as someone who implements environmental programs, we don't spend any of our time thinking about the ideologies around climate change, or do you believe in it or do you not believe in it? We can't do our jobs without addressing the changes in our environment that we're all seeing. So we are still on the ground, working with our states and communities, addressing those issues. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Great. Yeah, there was several questions about the local possibilities, and but you mentioned that. Here's the last kind of scientific question here. Several questions from the audience about the role of nuclear power in dealing with the climate change issue as a non-carbon source of energy. I can remember the old anti-nuclear movement, and it feels like it's come a long way. The situation has come a long way since then, but any thoughts or comments on it?
Well, maybe as the physicist in the group, I should be the one
Okay, go ahead.
to address that. And my viewpoint is not popular among my tree hugger friends. I think it's a tool in the toolkit, and I look at issues. The issue, of course, is safety. Although I think perhaps a bigger issue really should be cost. Nuclear power is very expensive. Low carbon sources of energy at this point are much less expensive. But in terms of safety, I mean, the reality is there's never been a known fatality in the United States due to nuclear power. And there's no other power source I can say that about, even the low carbon energy sources. And of course, fossil fuels are terribly dangerous. And coal in particular produces enormous particulate pollution, which has enormous health impacts. That said, even today, I mean, something like 5,000 or 10,000 Americans die every year from particulate pollution due to coal. That number is a lot lower than it used to be, thanks to great work by Ken and his colleagues at EPA. And by the way, that number, the mortality per unit coal burned in the United States is 20 times lower than it is in China. And that's a great testament to the effectiveness of the science and the regulatory environment that we have in this country. Anyway, my bottom line on nuclear power, yeah, I think it should be part of the picture. A lot of countries use it, I mean, a lot more than we do. France, I think, generates 80 or 85% of their electricity through nuclear power.
Anybody else have a thought on this? Okay, well, the scientific view is the last comment on that. So listen, there's an obvious question that I think many people have asked and always ask, which is, what can we do? What can Harvard do, and what can we do as citizens? So before I give you your last comments, your last general comments that you want to make, what recommendations do you have for what people should be doing and what Harvard should be doing? Conor, why don't we start with you?
Happy to. So I think if the question is what can we do as Harvard alums or Harvard students or Harvard community members, well, a key answer is start with Harvard. This is obviously, a very broad problem, and there's plenty of stuff to do around the world, but there's also a lot we can do at our own institution. Perhaps this takes the form of the faculty who are doing amazing work on fighting climate crisis in the classroom and in the lab. Perhaps this has to do with alumni, who are, the HA has a wonderful shared interest group on the environment. Perhaps this has to do with the question of Harvard as an institution. I am a member of the fossil fuel divestment movement, which argues that Harvard should be an environmental leader through its financial decisions. We argue that the myth of value-free capital is just that, a myth that when we subsidize continued extraction, it's not just an economic calculus, it's a decision that actively enables the continued economic and social capital that these industries receive. And so for people who are interested in the recognition that being declining to act in the face of injustice is not being value neutral, that by engaging in large scale deployments in green technology and renewable energy infrastructure and good clean energy jobs, we can bring about a more just and stable future. That's one way to get involved. So there are plenty of ways to get involved, but I urge members of the audience to consider the ways in which we can do that right here at Harvard.
Danielle, as somebody whose views on the practice of citizenship and civic engagement are kind of legendary, what are your thoughts here in response to that question?
I've just put in the chat some of President Bakow's remarks from the decision that was announced last April about achieving carbon neutral footprint for the endowment by 2050. That, personally, I think that's a big deal. I think that was a very significant decision. And so I think there's a lot of concrete work to be done in the alumni community to ask the question quarter by quarter, like literally every quarter, what does that mean? What are the tools that endowment managers need in order to achieve this? What tools are in development? How's that progress going on those tools? I think we should be asking for a quarterly report back on that question, and I think that would be very powerful. So that would be the Harvard question. I think I've beaten my drum a few times on the broader question. I do think that it would be great to see the democracy reform and climate justice movements come together. And so I would really encourage that as another way to get involved and to continue moving things forward by increasing responsiveness in our political institutions.
Okay. Ken, Phil?
Yeah, I would make a specific suggestion is to ask people whether you've seen your community's climate action plan. And Do you know whether your community has one? If you don't, you can find out. We've created a database for this New England states. You can go to epa.gov/RAINE, RAINE, and find out what your community has. If there already is a plan, there may be groups of people working on different aspects that you could probably join. The plan may be nearing the time when it's going to be updated. You could probably volunteer to be part of that process. There may be things that you want to work on. And I really feel like the participatory government part of climate change is really important. And so that's something concrete you can do.
Okay. Kind of sort of deserves to come back to you a little bit about the role of activism here. Anything you want to say about being an activist? Phil, did you have something you wanted to say on this? I'm sorry, I skipped you.
Sure, thank you. A couple thoughts. I mean, one on what can individuals do, and I always frame that in terms of three things. And one is to set an example in your own lifestyle. And I really believe in the importance of that, not because your own personal greenhouse gas emissions are particularly significant, but just because it's important to model behaviors that you want others to emulate. And I'm old enough to remember, for example, when recycling was something that only the wackos did. And it long has become, shall we say, very mainstream. And that will happen with other environmental practices as well. So it's great if you can set an example and lead in that way. Getting involved politically is also really important. And of course, voting is, in my view, de minimis. I mean, there's a lot you can do on a local level. You can run for office if you're so inclined. I think that's really important. And a specific thing that's important is when you do talk to your elected representatives, it's great to let them know that climate change is an issue that determines how you vote. And that really gets to the heart of their survival instinct. And finally, there's just all kinds of ways to get involved. I mean, because climate change is such a comprehensive problem that touches so many aspects, there's a way that almost anyone can use their interests and their talents to contribute to solving the problem. There's all kinds of great groups who are working on all kinds of different aspects of the problem, and many of those have opportunities to get involved, even if it's nothing more than contributing money. And just one final thought specifically on what Harvard could do. I agree with everything that's been said. One thing I would add, which I think I didn't hear anyone else mention, is to set an example in their own environmental practices and make the campus energy neutral or carbon neutral. And maybe that's underway, I don't know, but if it's not, it ought to be. I mean, it's a big challenge, but it can be done. And if you want to talk the talk, I think it's important. It's important to walk the walk. And maybe this isn't fair because Woodwell is a much smaller organization, but we've been energy neutral for a while, and we generate all our own power through our own wind and solar capability. So it can be done.
Okay. All right, we've got about just 5 minutes left, so I think we have time to give each of our panelists a kind of last word. I'll share a personal story, which was my mother was always the last person to leave a party, and my father always wanted to leave early. And so he would, at some point when he had had enough, he would go over to my mother and he would say, "Florence, make your concluding remarks." So this is your opportunity to make your concluding remarks. Why don't we start with, we'll go the opposite way from where we started. We'll start with Danielle.
Well, really mine are simply to say thank you. I appreciate the opportunity for this conversation. I'm glad that the alumni community is so engaged in these questions. And I particularly welcome the sort of bringing together different kinds of expertise in this conversation. I think that ability for us to partner across different areas of expertise is really fundamental to forward movement here, and hasn't always characterized efforts in the climate change space.
Okay, great. Connor?
Absolutely. I'd like to echo that. Just so grateful for all the panelists and to the HA for putting this together. And I guess I'd just like to say it is as scary as this is, it is not too late. There are vested interests that stand to benefit if we give up hope, if we take climate crisis as a given. It is true that the longer we wait, the more narrow our options become, the more unpleasant the path becomes. And it's true that these are tough questions. How do we balance the need to have overarching solutions with the need to listen to the individual communities on the front lines? How do we balance these different forces pulling in different directions? And that's why I think it's so exciting right now to see the upwelling of activism around the world, seeking to bring together these concerns, these scientific concerns, these political concerns, these moral concerns, and channel it not just in anger at a broken system, but in constructing an affirmative vision for what a just and stable future can look like. I think that's what makes this such an exciting moment, as much as it is a scary moment, and we'll see where this leads.
Thanks, Connor. Ken?
Really appreciated the moments in this conversation when we've touched on the importance of values. And one of the reasons for that is because I think we've all observed ideology is a really unwelcome guest at this party. It really has made things difficult. And the way we kind of usher it maybe towards the door is to replace it with discussions about values, because regardless of people's politics, there are things about their communities that they want to protect. And that's what the discussion needs to be about.
Great. Phil, we come back. You had the first word. You get the last.
Well, thank you. And I'll just end on well, I hope this isn't a downer, but I mean, our future really is at stake. And as Connor said, as we wait and don't act, the options for what our future looks like get narrower and narrower. And the decisions that we make today, whether by actively deciding or simply doing nothing, have profound consequences for future generations. The past is simply not going to look like the present, and that's a tough thing to swallow, but that's a reality. And I guess I'll close by saying that there are some lessons we can take from the COVID, from the present pandemic, and one of those lessons is that it's important to recognize the threat and be honest about what it is that we're facing and what it is that we're dealing with, and in addition, recognize the threat and have a comprehensive plan for dealing with it. And that plan should be, as we've seen from COVID, that plan should be based on or should involve science-based policies. And I think COVID has provided us with a very, very vivid demonstration. By looking across nations, we can see that policies based on science work. Policies based on wishful thinking simply don't work. They collide with physical reality. And the same thing will happen on climate change if we don't have policies based on the real facts on the ground.
Listen, I want to thank all of the panelists very, very much. This was a great discussion from my point of view. And I want to especially thank Valerie Nin and Terry Connolly for kind of moving this agenda as citizens, as grassroots citizens, actually. And lastly, I just want to say that please remember that the next event in the series, the third event, is Changing Hearts and Minds on Climate Change. All of how we can do that. And that will take place on November 18th. All right, so thanks to everybody. Thanks to the participants. Thanks to the audience. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.